Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the 12th episode of the AfghanEye podcast. I'm your host Sangar and I'm joined by my co-host Ahmed-Waleed Kakar. How are you doing?
Yeah, assalamu alaikum guys. Assalamu alaikum Sangar, assalamu alaikum to everyone. Yeah, I mean, in the UK we've got quite a heat wave at the moment. It's something like 30 degrees over here. What about you guys, Sangar? Is it the same?
I think for people who are watching the video, you can already see some sweat on my head.
I hope not.
Because it's extremely hot out here. It's incredible, but we are expecting rain and storm later on tonight. So inshallah, the weather will cool down. So what have you been doing lately?
Well, I mean, I don't know if you've heard, Sangar, but there's been the book of John Bolton that's been released. Despite President Trump trying to block it, still it managed to circulate all over the internet, and especially for Afghans, especially with regard to Afghanistan, as people who are very interested in developments in Afghanistan, the book is filled with juice.
So before we do that, before we discuss the book, before we actually review this book, let's just get to know John Bolton, because obviously John Bolton, former national security advisor of President Donald Trump, is quite a how would you say infamous character, and
infamous and influential.
Exactly, very influential. So, John Bolton, graduate from Yale Law School in 1970. He graduated summa cum laude, so it means he's a very highly educated man.
The real deal.
The real deal. So he's not a joke. So anything he says about politics or whatever, we have to always bear in mind that this man is actually very highly educated. He worked as a lawyer. He was a former ambassador to the UN. He worked for George W. Bush, George H. Bush, George Sr. And Reagan. Yeah, he worked for both of those two Republican presidents during their administrations. He worked at the Justice Department, at the State Department. He was also responsible for a particular job at USAID. And his most recent government position was obviously National Security Advisor of President Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's with regard to John Bolton, for those that do and don't know him, he's known quite for being a neocon. Okay, he served as ambassador to the UN in Bush's second term. Okay, this is
Bush Jr.
Bush Jr., George W. Bush, and obviously he's recently been a national security advisor for Donald Trump. So I think it's safe to say that he's on the Republican side of the spectrum.
Yes.
But I think there's one, like in my opinion, there's one point in particular that typifies his political leaning. So in this book, actually, he says that his first experience of political campaigning was in 1964. Okay, and it was for Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign against Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, for those that don't know, I actually did a module on the Cold War and U.S. politics in my third year of university. But for those that don't know, Barry Goldwater was a staunch Republican. Not only was he a staunch Republican, he was very much in favor of using nuclear weapons in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So Barry Goldwater was a fan of using nuclear weapons in Vietnam. And there was a saying, that one of his campaign slogans was, "In your heart, you know he's right." And that's obviously regarding Barry Goldwater. And Lyndon Johnson's campaign spun that into, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." And I would say I agree with that, because which sane person is fond of using nuclear weapons in Vietnam? But in any case, that's 1964. But what's important to note here is that this is John... Yeah.
another important quote from Barry Goldwater. He said that he's an extremist in defense of liberty. He said, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. So that's the kind of guy he was. He basically described himself as an extremist. And this reminds me of Frank Lunt's book, Words That Work. He's a Republican strategist who advised many very prominent Republican politicians. And Frank Luntz said that the reason why Barry Goldwater lost and the reason why he was such a failure is because he appealed to certain ideas that were, even back then in the 60s, they were considered as absolutely taboo. Like, for instance, saying that you're an extremist. John Bolton was attracted to a guy like Barry Goldwater in his youth.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that shows it all. The fact that a man who's going around proudly calling himself an extremist and pro-nuclear weapons, this is John Bolton's first political hero. So I think that says all that it needs to with regard to situating Bolton on the ideological or foreign policy spectrum.
And speaking of being ideological and extreme, when I see John Bolton with his mustache, he always reminds me of those Khalqi intellectuals, those Afghan Khalqi intellectuals with their big mustaches, You see them always, these old Khalqi uncles who always have these very extreme and radical ideas about politics. Like, that guy who is always on television in Afghanistan, they always invite him to debate. He's some sort of political analyst. What's his name? But he also has a very big mustache, just like John Bolton and a glass,
In another life, John Bolton could have been Shahnawaz Tanai's brother.
Yeah, exactly.
For those that don't know, Shahnawaz Tanai was the ex-defense minister who tried to launch a coup together with Hikmatyar against Dr. Najib. I think it was in 1990. But yeah, so John Bolton, potential Khalqi, but now he's just potential Khalqi, but now a diehard American neocon.
Yes. Okay. So, let's mention something that most people may have forgotten or may not know about John Bolton. In 2013, John Bolton became the chair of the infamous Gatestone Institute. And for those of you who don't know, Gatestone Institute is an organization, it's a think tank that was created to promote a very radical warmongering agenda, not just in the United States, but also in other Western countries. Gatestone Institute is financed by the Mercer family, and the Mercer family, they're extremely wealthy family, very powerful in America. They fund all sorts of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, and far-right organizations. So this gentleman, John Bolton, was the chair of Gatestone Institute, and Gatestone Institute supports politicians, radical right-wing extremist commentators, figures like the Dutch far-right politician Geert Wilders. John Bolton is also very closely associated with Pamela Geller, Robert Spencer. Both of them are infamous, what they characterize infamous Islamophobes. They basically spread fear of Islam in Western societies, they have very wild conspiracy theories. Like while John Bolton was the head of Gatestone Institute, they published several reports where they basically suggested that Muslims are quietly trying to take over Europe, that all these refugees who are coming to Europe, that they are all part of a big conspiracy by Muslims to take over Europe. So you can understand that when you have a very highly educated, very influential and accomplished career politician from United States, who becomes the head of a very infamous and very radical institution like the Gatestone Institute.
Sorry, Sangar, it's just that, even in the book it comes across. So what Bolton says is that he is attracted or takes up the national security advisor role because he sort of divides it into several categories. So he says at the strategic level, the US is facing the threats of Russia and China. But then he also says that there are the threats of Islamicist terrorism in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Lebanon. Okay, so you have to... immediately one has to think, okay, those are 4 very different countries with different dynamics in the conflicts that are being played there. So if someone is lumping them all together, it either reveals a sort of a prejudice or it reveals a lack of information. Now, with John Bolton, you can't assume, I know many people would assume that the man's purely an idiot, but I really doubt that, because idiots don't graduate from Yale Law School and go on to become successful career politicians. So It reveals that there is an inherent bigotry there.
Yeah. And what's important is that obviously he's stint at the Gatestone Institute may somehow be overlooked by many, but it is a very important aspect of who John Bolton is, what what kind of ideas he has, and what does it mean to have someone with that kind of mindset becoming the national security advisor of the American president. It was a quite shocking decision by Trump. Obviously, a lot of people say Donald Trump is a bigot, he's a white nationalist, he's an Islamophobe, etc. But even for Trump's standards, it was quite an extreme decision to pick this guy as a national security advisor. So when he was national security advisor,
we have to bear in mind that Trump came all about against endless wars, against the Washington swamp, draining the swamp, if anyone remembers that. Bolton is the swamp personified. Okay? Bolton is endless war personified. So Trump nominating him and selecting him as his national security advisor is big news. And I think there's one passage that really articulates best how Bolton views the world, how Bolton views Islam and Muslims with regard to the United States. So the passage reads that war by radical Islamist terrorists against the United States began long before 9/11 and will continue long after. You can like it or not, but it is reality. Donald Trump didn't like it and acted like it wasn't true. So we can, to a certain degree of credibility, we can say that whilst Trump is characterized as, anti-Muslim and all of that, Bolton probably exceeds him in that sentiment. Okay?
Exactly.
When we're discussing Afghanistan, as we will in this conversation, with regard to this book that's been released, which is quite a bombshell, actually, we need to bear in mind where Bolton is coming from with all of this. So this is a man whose first exposure to political campaigning was Barry Goldwater. Hey, let's nuke Vietnam. Then it was, very Republican, very much on the right, a hawk on foreign policy issues. And now he's saying something that is quite at odds with what Trump's mantra is, with Trump's mantra being, I'm sick and tired of endless wars, bring our soldiers home. And Bolton is saying, actually, no, this is a perpetual war that's going to be waged until the day of judgment, until the apocalypse.
Okay, we're going to go into that later on, but in order to prepare for the show, obviously, while I was doing some research, I listened to his recent interview with USA Today. And basically, he spoke to USA Today for about an hour. And during that conversation, when he was asked, like, what is your biggest objection against Donald Trump? And he said, lack of philosophy. So in his mind, Donald Trump doesn't have a coherent political philosophy that guides his foreign policy and domestic policy. So he wants to proliferate himself as someone who is very principled and very strict on his views and beliefs about politics, and that he is guided by a very well laid out political philosophy. But what is his political philosophy? What is it?
In the book he says that only the intellectually dishonest buy into labels with regard to foreign policy, but that if he were to describe himself, he would describe himself as pro-America. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, how being pro-America can be reconciled with waging war and destruction abroad that actually bankrupts America?
Yeah.
I don't really know, but at least in John Bolton's mind, it seems to work.
Okay. So, Waleed, after reading the book, can you tell me what was your first impression?
The first impression, I guess, is that it's a pretty heavy read. There's a lot of detail involved. Now, obviously, if John Bolton is the national security advisor, he's got logs, to telephone transcripts, everything of the sort. So it's very detailed and referenced. To be fair, I think it just lifts the lid on how Washington approaches its affairs abroad. For me personally, it was refreshing, but that's because I found Trump's presidency in general to be refreshing. There is no bullshit about it. It's straight in your face. And to see that, or to read it rather, behind closed doors as to exactly what these guys are articulating, it was pretty refreshing. I think Bolton, in certain instances, obviously was trying to make himself look good at Trump's expense, whereas, if anything, he did the opposite. But, I mean, that's just my perspective.
Yeah. And he mentioned Afghanistan quite a lot in his book.
I think the book, I don't remember exactly, it's very well referenced. It's got pages and pages of, index and whatever, but he mentioned Afghanistan and Afghans 178 times, I believe. And the book itself is about 210 pages. So that's almost one mention of Afghanistan per book. He mentions
per page.
Per book, per page, yeah. So, I mean, Afghanistan is very much, and Bolton in the book is really clear about his objections to Trump's policy toward Afghanistan with regard to negotiations, that sort of thing. He's very clear about that, and probably one of the causes as to why he ended up being estranged and ostracized from the administration.
And if you would characterize this book, how would you characterize it? What kind of book is this?
The book reads like the memoirs of a man who was stuck in 2001. Okay? He is stuck. He clearly, we've mentioned Bolton is highly educated. He's worked as a diplomat, he's worked as a politician, policy advisor, whatever. But it's a man who's stuck in 2001. It's the same old terminology, jargon, and rhetoric that's being used. So, for example, he groups together Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. Not once, but frequently throughout the book. Okay. Yeah. Now, obviously, we've discussed how rife the propaganda has been in the Western world, in the Washington bubble, and indeed in the Kabul bubble, to equate all of these groups with one another. We did that in the podcast with Sayyid Ibrahim and to a lesser extent with Mozambique. But the fact that he's lumping together these groups basically is, trying to whitewash the attitude of how can we negotiate with the Taliban when they're exactly like ISIS? We would never negotiate with ISIS. And there's one quote that I think I read out earlier with regard when he says that Islamist terror was being waged against the US before 9/11. It will be waged afterwards, and this is a reality. And Trump doesn't like to accept this reality. Okay, but now we get to the point of what is Islamist in the mind of John Bolton. What is an Islamist? Okay, because it's obviously a used and an abused term. So just for the sake of context, we're going to shoot out from Afghanistan. He's in one part of the book, in many parts of the book actually, he's talking about Turkey's President Erdogan. Okay? Now, Bolton is saying that despite repeated efforts by key allied leaders in Europe and the Middle East, as well as his own advisors, Trump couldn't grasp the fact that Erdogan himself was a radical Islamicist. Okay? So, in Bolton's mind, Erdogan is a radical Islamicist. Well, then where the hell does that leave the Taliban? Okay.
so Erdogan, who if Erdogan is an Islamist,
exactly,
based on what? Like because
he mentions in the book that Erdogan is trying to move Turkey away from the secular nation state that was established by Mustafa Kemal. Okay, now that may be true. Okay, I wouldn't call myself a Turkey expert and I won't get too much into it, but there's no doubt over the last decade or decade and a half even that, Islam and religion has become very legitimized in the political mainstream in Turkey. And Erdogan has played a major role in that. Okay? There's no denying that. At the same time, though, Erdogan is, at the end of the day, a politician, a very shrewd politician, but his Islamism or Islamicism, as Bolton says, does not really extend to any sort of sympathy or solidarity with the Uyghurs in, currently being imprisoned or, put in concentration camps by China. Erdogan obviously is quite loud in criticizing Israel, doesn't seem to mind quite a few business deals with Israel. So, Erdogan is a politician like many others, currently leading a secular state, swearing allegiance to a secular constitution. And so, if Erdogan is a radical Islamicist, then, like I said, where there's really no hope for anyone even slightly further in the spectrum.
And while he was head of the Gatestone Institute, he also contributed to certain ideas about Muslim organizations in America and in other Western countries. And Gatestone Institute and all of his associates, people like Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller, they label many Muslim rights organizations such as Council for Islam in
American Islam Relations. Yeah.
Yes. He basically these group of people like Bolton and Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer, they characterize those organizations as Islamist. So even if they operate within the legal system of United States, they are still characterized as Islamist, and he thinks that Islamists are responsible for terrorism. So we could argue that in his mind, any Muslim who has some kind of political aspiration is a terrorist.
Exactly.
So when you have someone like that with that kind of mindset, trying to argue about certain positions in American foreign policy, you can only come to just one conclusion: he wants endless war.
And that, it comes back to the point about Barry Goldwater. That's essentially the gist of it. I think.
Yes.
We're speaking about the broader attitudes toward Islam, toward Muslims, towards a Muslim political consciousness. Erdogan is a radical Islamicist, so well, damn, the rest of us are doomed. But this is someone that had Trump's ear. He was his advisor. And we've spoken often with many guests about how Afghanistan serves as a microcosm of the war on terror. And the war on terror actively seeks to delegitimize any sort of Muslim consciousness, political, social, or otherwise. Now, Bolton has the ear of President Trump, who, is someone that went around on his campaign trail saying stuff like Islam hates us. Okay, now on that basis, I don't know whether he consulted an alim, Islamic scholar, or anything of the sort, but this is it seems like a match made in heaven. Okay, yeah. You've got Gatestone Institute, ex-Gatestone Institute chair, sitting with the President of the United States, who hasn't made his, let's say, his aversion to Islam and Muslims unknown. It's not really hidden. You would think that it's a marriage made in heaven. However, the marriage doesn't really work out. Bolton doesn't really remain as a national security advisor very long, and it's wrought with disagreements. And this is where we come to Afghanistan.